Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to Davos, and we apologize for our technical problems at the beginning. I hope that next year we get it right, 4 years in a row, not. Professor James Cooper is hosting this panel, and this is an introductory panel where we will discuss the bigger picture from the agenda, and I am really happy to have Joe London in. Joe, thank you very much for joining us for it. He holds 2 years a speech in Digital Davos, which was fantastic and changed my perspective from what your company is doing and about space. And it was one of the most wonderful speeches which I hear.
Thanks.
Dr. Richard Weinstein, thank you so much for joining us in the last moment. We had some changes. I heard so much good from Jamie about you, and I'm really looking forward to your view. And without any more delay, because we are already in delay, I give over the panel to Professor James Cooper, and thank you very much for joining Digital Davos.
Thank you, Carl, and welcome everybody. I'm James Cooper. I'm a professor at California Western School of Law and a research fellow at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. I'm a columnist, I advise governments, and I'm a serial disruptor. And I'm really, really excited because we've got two great panelists with us today to talk about restoring trust during a pandemic and amid uncertainty. How do we shape equitable, inclusive, and sustainable change? Now, our two other panelists you might have been waiting for, the Goodwill Ambassador from the UN, activist filmmaker, animal rights advocate, Dia Mirza, couldn't be with us, but she'll be on a fireside chat a little bit later with Carl, I believe tomorrow. And also Chrissy Lightfoot, who is a British lawyer, futurist, strategist, and leadership guru. Unfortunately had a last minute family urgent matter, and she apologizes and sends her best to everybody else. But we are super excited to have Joe Landon here, who's from Lockheed Martin, Vice President of Advanced Program Development. And we've got Dr. Richard Weinstein from, who's an eye surgeon and a serial investor, and also one of the principals at iStart, a medtech incubator firm out of Canada. So welcome everyone. Again, our panel is about restoring trust after the pandemic. And maybe we should start with you, Joe, because your team at Lockheed Martin was able to do so much in this period of time when the rest of us are trying just not to get COVID, and we should see that as a success. Tell us about what you've been doing and kind of leadership skills you've had to exhibit to get your team especially with respect to the James Webb telescope and the recent unshielding and so forth.
Sure, yeah, thanks so much, James. So again, I'm Joe Landon. I'm the Vice President for Advanced Programs Development at Lockheed Martin Space. And my role, I lead the team at Lockheed Martin that develops and implements our space exploration strategy. And at Lockheed Martin, along with many scientific and other partners, we've had over 50 years of leadership in space exploration, having designed and built epic space missions like the Hubble Space Telescope and Cassini and the Juno Jupiter probe and others. So we're sort of excited and we're fortunate to be able to continue that work, even during the pandemic. I mean, one of the things about our work, particularly our planetary exploration work, where we send these robotic missions out to the far reaches of the solar system, there are often very limited windows of time of opportunity to send those missions out into space because of the relative motion of the planets. And, if we're sending a mission even to Mars, but this matters even more for missions out further into the solar system, you've got to launch on a certain date, or you might have to wait years, like 10 years in some cases, for the next opportunity to do it. So pandemic or not, we had to press forward and with these missions. So one of the missions that was executed for a large part during the pandemic, where it wasn't about launching the satellite, it was about once the spacecraft got to where it was going, it was called OSIRIS-REx. And it was a asteroid exploration spacecraft that a year ago in August, July, took a sample from an asteroid called Bennu. And it took many years for this spacecraft to reach the asteroid. And once it got there, even though it was in the midst of the pandemic, we had to do that operation. And we had folks operating this spacecraft out an asteroid, millions and millions of miles away from their basements and home offices, in fact. So it was really exciting and a ray of hope during this pandemic. I think we could talk more about this as we go on, but I think, space exploration, is an endeavor that's shared, has shared benefits and interests of all humanity. So, hopefully we can offer some hope and excitement and some wonder to our lives as we go out there and do incredible science. And that's sort of a good news story that we've had and be able to maintain here throughout the pandemic.
Thanks for that, Joe. Let's go from like happy positive to not nearly as happy positive. Dr. Weinstein, you yourself have had some medical issues over the last couple of weeks with 2 broken legs, and you're still operating. Can you talk a little bit about how healthcare has diminished trust, or the healthcare profession has both helped, but also in some cases hindered what we've been facing with the pandemic, please?
So I actually think, James, that's probably the most important question we should be asking ourselves, because this is a public health issue, a medical issue. And I've been amazed to watch how standard operating procedure for how we do randomized controlled trials, how we support evidence-based medicine, how we make these decisions has been just completely disregarded. And I understand that in an emergency, things change, but they can't change this much. And I think it's been really unfortunate to watch how the physician group has been essentially censored. So there really is no discourse. There is no conversation that's contrary to what a mandate that's been put in place to achieve at all costs. And that's been concerning. And I'll give you a great example. So if you look at how vaccines used to typically work, it wasn't 4 weeks of data or 6 weeks of data. It was years of data. And a great example would be when Merck got the varicella chickenpox vaccine approved back in '99 and 2000, they had 12 or 13 years of data. They had 10-year follow-up. They had 4 or 5 major studies. And in this case, we're vaccinating children with 1 or 2 or 3 months of data. And it's not that they shouldn't be vaccinated, but there should be a conversation. And we should never be in a situation where we have the inability to have discourse. And I think, to me, that's been the greatest concern, is watching how medicine has really taken a backseat to the politics, to the emotion, to anecdotal evidence. And I think that's something we have to quickly try and reverse and get back to where we were before the pandemic.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you this, Joe. You've been called Mr. Astropreneur, a space entrepreneur, and been celebrated with your Space Angels and some of the incubation, some of the startups that you've been able to fund and help lead. And you've been a leader on human spaceflight, on microgravity research, on space habitats. What's the role of private capital and big business to help us out of the pandemic and to shape an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable future?
Yeah, sure. So thanks. Try to tie all these topics together. I think, the role of private capital in space exploration and maybe science in general, I think, private capital versus government investment, I would say, is the two that we talk about most here in the space industry. Is, government investment really has to go towards things that are not economically viable yet. Right? It's how do we do science and understand what, answer some key questions. Whereas private investment really is to go in and commercialize and develop infrastructure and develop technologies to further that science and to create new markets. So I think again, it's similar to probably medicine and other areas too, like climate, right, where the government needs to come in and make good decisions about where to invest in basic research and understanding some scientific questions, and then let industry come in and make use sort of economic decisions to further some of those capabilities, if that makes sense.
Indeed. And you raise a good point about government, and this kind of moves us towards public-private partnerships, which has been Lockheed Martin's bread and butter from being part of the military-industrial complex all the way through to space exploration. Rich, Are you a fan of the public-private partnership, or do you think that for-profit corporations, which have shareholder value as their end, and rightfully so, that's what a corporation is, it's to do well, not necessarily to do good. Now, yes, there's corporate social responsibility and the business roundtable and new ways to move ESG into the corporate profile and the guts of it, of how they operate. But the public sector is a very different animal. You work in a place with socialized medicine. How has it worked out, do you think, one, public-private, and two, whether public institutions have done well during the pandemic generally?
So I think to answer your last comment first, I think the public institutions, at least in Canada, I can't comment about other places other than what I hear anecdotally, but at least in Canada, these institutions have not done well. And so, for example, it's fascinating to turn on the TV here and see that the Leafs are playing at home in front of nobody, but you could turn on the TV the next night and see that their stadium in Buffalo is full. So I think what's driving our response in Ontario and possibly throughout the country is that we have a socialized medical system that really had very little capacity built into it for events like this. It's just not designed that way. So I trained in Philadelphia, then came back to Toronto to work. And the hospitals in the US are, so in their mind, having more patients is not bad. The hospitals here aren't designed that way. So they're not designed to have extra ICU beds or extra staffing. So as it stands right now, most of my surgery, I guess it doesn't matter that I can't operate at this point, but most of my surgery is being canceled anyways, because the fragility of our healthcare system is sort of driving the entire public and political response. And I think to your first part going forward, absolutely in a system like this, there will be private-public partnerships that will have to develop going forward in order to deal with what is a demographic nightmare for us. We don't have the ability to treat the patients the way we should. We have massive wait time. So my wait time for cataract surgery right now is anywhere from 1.5 years to 2 years. It was bad before the pandemic. This obviously made it much worse. I think it's very difficult to tell people that you have this social contract where you have universal health care, but you can't access it. And I'm convinced going forward that Canada as a whole will start to shift more towards the idea of letting the private side take on some of this responsibility.
Fair enough. Joe, do you have any sense, or do you want to speak a little to public-private partnerships and what's been the success of Lockheed or some of the other companies you've worked with that have been able to do government contracting? I mean, people forget the internet was a government thing. It was a military thing. And like many of the wonderful dual use things that have emerged from government investment are the things that we take for granted every day in our consumer products.
Yeah, it's interesting, really building on what Rich commented about the healthcare system, which is really a question of capacity, right? And is there a better is having a sort of private industry come in and take a bigger role, help build that capacity? I think we have similar questions in science and exploration as well, where is the government can only do so much, and there's a sense that the private sector with its economic motivations can come in and solve problems quicker, or maybe allocate capital in a more efficient way than a government. So that's a kind of interesting dialogue to think about. I mean, if you look back in history, at least in aerospace, a lot of the achievements and the scientific discoveries that we have achieved started with government investment. But now there's a lot of private investment flowing into the space sector in particular that is making, sort of accelerating the pace of what we can do, and making those government investments, which have grown steadily but slowly, but nothing compared to how much private capital has come in to the sector over the last 10 years. So that makes that government investment go farther. So it's interesting here to think about the analogies between the medical and healthcare sector and space, where how can we encourage private sector capital to come in and provide attractive problems for industry to solve, so that we can get more out of our government investment.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. And can I ask folks to turn off mute their mics if they would, who are also on the call, but not necessarily part of the speakers group. Thanks so much. Rich, actually, let me ask you, Carl, because you trained as a doctor in Italy. You're also a serial investor, and you as a Swiss citizen, you approached a public-private, and you're very differently than, say, North Americans do. What do you see in terms of public-private investment and ways that together that the public sector and private equity can rebuild trust in a post-pandemic world?
I believe that the joining from public and private is extremely important. And it's even more important when we see, for example, in space exploration, like Joe's company, which basically brought hope. We remember historically, trying to bring a man to the moon was not a waste of money. Look at all the products which were coming in, and Dr. Weinstein will confirm, like the heart pacemaker, Teflon, all this what was coming out as side products were really developing ahead. With private with private and the government joining together, enormous things can be done. We saw it during the pandemic, which were allowing in America to create ventilators really quick, which then were not used because medicine was improving, which probably we see. But also right now in finance, and this is the interesting thing for my company, which creates virtual hedge funds in the Cayman Islands, where we allow to create an investment fund within days instead of months. So a lot of private individuals start to pull together the money, and then our team analyzes where to invest. And there we have also investments in government projects as joint ventures, which are really interesting, from getting smart cities done to joining in developing harbors, roads, and so on. This is the future.
And when you think about the moonshot or some of the other early advancements of humankind, a lot of this came out of the science developed during World War II on both sides. That that sometimes these incredibly difficult challenges that sometimes kill millions and millions of people. Ironically, there is some good that comes out of this. What can come out of the pandemic, Joe? Do you think that will make the world a better place? In it, obviously the space exploration that your company is doing is one of the things we can all be super proud of. But are there some other things as well?
Yeah. So my thoughts on this, the pandemic is an example of where the world had to come together to work on a common problem. And we didn't really have much lead time, right? It had to happen all right at once. And there certainly was some things went well, but a lot of things could have gone better, during this global collaboration. And I think we're still in the midst of it here, as Rich was saying, where we've got very different approaches in some cases. But what I see, again, my role, coming from the space exploration frame or perspective is that, what we need to do in the future is work together on hard problems together before there's a gun to our head, in a global pandemic. So, doing things like the Artemis program, or where the U.S. has, 13 countries who are signed on to work together on this next wave of lunar exploration. Like, that's something we can all choose to do, a problem we can work together as a species and as a planet, so that when it comes time to have an urgent problem that needs to be solved, like a pandemic, we know who to call, and we have some relationships established and some ways of working together, some practice, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
So there's a playbook, in other words, we can go to for these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
We were supposed to have those ahead of time. Some administrations chose to throw them out, unfortunately. But let me ask
James, that ain't in here as the curator. Dr. Nicholas Pericon is also on the panel, and probably
we just need to get his video up, and we're ready to go. Dr. Periconi, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
As Carl's making the video work, and you'll have to engage your video, could you tell us, we're talking about trust and where public institutions and private firms and private capital for-profits, if you will, can work together, or how do we rebuild trust? Do you have any ideas on that, please?
Well, yes. One of the, as a physician and also as a nutritionist, one of the I think one of the most obvious things that I could see is that in the low socioeconomic areas, no matter what country, a higher incidence of disease, and also there is a mistrust of the healthcare system, and that leads to vaccine resistance. So I think what we need to do is basically take the private industry and try to solve some of these problems, like the areas with low socioeconomic areas. They do not have proper nutrition. They don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Nutritional status is terrible, low vitamin C, no vitamin D. So higher incidence of disease and higher mortality rates. And so this has led to tremendous mistrust that was already there before this started. And so I think we really have to focus on this area. It can save a lot of lives. At the same time, they've got to be brought into the healthcare system.
And that brings a kind of an education piece to all of this, that we really have a lot of work to do. And that's a public sector issue, clearly. But on the issue of equity and inclusion, Joe, how do we make sure that, you know, this space exploration is incredibly exciting and wonderful for humankind, but how do we make sure it's good for everybody? It's not just, you know, a great, you know, new thing for rich people to be able to do their personal space flights, but that all the mining, the exploration, the good things that can come out of this can be shared globally.
Sure, you know, great question. I think that, you know, for the history of all types of, you know, most science and certainly in space exploration, the benefits have been shared by all, where it's, you know, understanding our solar system and our universe has, you know, maybe sometimes esoteric or far removed benefits from everyday life, but it still benefits our you know, whole species with this understanding of our, you know, of where we came from. I think this relatively new phenomenon of very wealthy people being able to go to space, that only helps things. I mean, that all that money that Jeff Bezos and others have spent, and even the passengers who are flying on these flights, you know, I often hear this, people incorrectly say, oh, well, we shouldn't be sending money into space. Like, actually, no money actually goes into space. Like, the money is spent here on Earth, every single dollar of it. And it's spent by, you know, engineers and scientists and folks who are working to develop these capabilities. And I think that benefits certainly the economy, but also you know, builds on other capabilities and you know, helps leverage those government investments for new stuff in the future. Thank
you. You know, going from the space gold rush to telemedicine, I want to ask our physicians on the panel. We've seen the incredible digitization of whether it's crypto or the metaverse. Everything has gone online. Education. How have, and maybe Rich, you can start, and then Nicholas, if you would, how has telemedicine affected your practice, and do you see a role for this going forward, especially with respect to AI?
Absolutely, James. So it hasn't had a huge impact on us yet because most of what I do has intervention. But if you look at diagnostics, and especially during the pandemic, most of my patients now who see their primary care doctors see them virtually. And this has been going on for the last year and a half. And then you have to ask yourself the question, then if I'm making my medical decisions based on diagnostic tests and your history, and I'm never going to physically examine you, what does that mean for the future? And I think this is probably a tipping point where as we go forward, you'll see a greater and greater shift towards home diagnostics, not coming to a physical location to be seen. And artificial intelligence is already playing a huge role. And even within ophthalmology right now, devices exist that can take a picture of your eye, take a look inside, and make a decision as to whether it's healthy or not. And I think as it goes forward, it'll make decisions with respect to treatment. So I think as we go forward, you're going to see a dramatic shift towards not just telemedicine, but really a paradigm shift in where patients are actually seen.
Would you agree, Nicholas, is AI going to play an increasing role? And what about all those people you were talking about, the lower socioeconomic levels of society? Are they going to get access to it too?
Yes, I think it's going to change things, and this is a permanent change. I'm a dermatologist, and so my colleagues are all essentially doing telemedicine, and of course, since it's a visual science, it's working out really well. But yes, what we need to do is we need to bring this socioeconomic group into the healthcare system, and they've got, And we've got to have a better relationship, because if you look at not just mortality, but the fact is there's a huge suspicion about the medical community, and therefore the vaccination hesitancy is a huge problem. And so the future is, yes, telemedicine, especially in the areas of my colleagues, because it's a visual science. But yes, this is the future, and diagnostics can also be done remotely, also using other technologies.
Thanks so much for that. We're going to do a lightning round now where everybody gets to answer in 30 seconds or less. And the question is, what was the thing during the pandemic? And I'd like to speak of the pandemic in the past, hopefully. What was the thing in the pandemic that was most positive, that will create the most trust or help rebuild our civil societies? Carl, do you want to go first?
I think digitalization. We learned to work together remotely, more efficiently. We learned to exchange information also outside the boardroom. And I think this will change the world forever. Upcoming telemedicine, digitalization, and this was the big leap forward which we had during this pandemic.
Thanks for that. How about you, Nicholas? What do you think?
I do think that one really positive thing about this is that although we've been separated physically and also masked most of the time, this has brought us together to work, especially as a physician, work together. And also my corporations have also functioned completely differently now. But once again, I think this crisis has brought us together in a very interesting way, and it's a digital way. Thank
you for that. Joe, any last thoughts?
Sure. You know, for me and my colleagues in the space industry, you know, the fact that we could finish building, launch, and now are in the midst of deploying a new, really world-changing space telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope, is a really incredible accomplishment for all of us. I think this the Hubble Space Telescope rewrote the textbooks on the universe, and James Webb is going to do that again. So, you know, this can bring us together in many ways. One, well, the fact that we were able to do it during the pandemic is incredible. But the science that the James Webb Space Telescope will enable will help us shed light on some really existential questions, like why did the universe start? Where do we come from? You know, why are we here? Like, so these are really exciting to be able to really enable scientists to look back, you know, toward the beginning of the universe.
Awesome. Rich, did you want to give a last thought, please?
Sure. I'll take a more pessimistic view, though, or a realistic view. I think we should be looking at these things to see what we did wrong and how we can make them better. And I find that this exposed the fragility in our political system, our educational system, our healthcare system. And those things can't be ignored. We have to figure out how to make all of those better going forward.
Great. Thank you all. Just on time, 9 o'clock. Thank you to our panelists, Joe Landon from Lockheed Martin, Dr. Nicholas Perricone, and Dr. Richard Weinstein. Thank you. Our senior curator, Dr. Carl Selig, thank you for allowing me to moderate. I'm James Cooper, professor of California Western School of Law, and welcome to Digital Davos, everyone. Thank you to all our panelists. Carl.